Got it? Okay, what a great event. In the beginning this morning, Jeff said that more or less everybody they asked came, and I think part of the reason is because of the nature of this event, focusing on mentoring. And the other thing I want to point out is I heard one of the folks doing the introductions this morning, mention this is Spark Me 215, so I want to congratulate Jeff and Naila for taking this on every year. Well done, mates. No, thank you so much for doing this. My interpretation of the charge, there's going to be a shameless advocacy here, and it's around the sorts of problems that school folks, district folks have to address day in, day out, for which we as a field don't have much to say to them, can't offer much support or guidance. So that's a part of my agenda in addressing the charge. So I'm going to start off by giving as quick as I humanly possibly can, overview of the work I and many others have been involved in for the last too many years, and then try and get to these problems or issues. So basically, I have a project called MIST. The issue we've been interested in is what does it take to support improvements in the quality of math teaching on a large scale, as in across a large urban district. We have formed partnerships, and I emphasize the word partnerships, with 4 districts. We started working with them in 2007. We worked with those 4 districts for 4 years. We have then continued working with 2 of those districts for another 4 years. We just made our last official visits to these districts earlier this month, after a swift 8 years. What was our long-term goal in doing this? To develop a theory of action, or at least a provisional theory of action for instructional improvement at scale in mathematics, where an instructional theory of action comprises both strategies or policies for supporting teachers and others' learning, together with a rationale for why it's reasonable to expect those strategies to be effective to support teachers' learning. How did we start out? The first thing we had to do for ourselves is clarify the nature of the problem. And I want to stress that supporting the learning of groups of teachers is critical, essential, and so forth. The big point, the position we took, it's not sufficient. Why? Because the influence of teacher professional development on classroom practice is mediated by the school and district context in which teachers work. I was in a discussion session organized by Elham just before lunch, and it came out very explicitly, people talking about the influence of principals' expectations for what should be happening in classrooms. I'm pointing to that kind of stuff. What do we conclude from that? Yes, it's about supporting teachers' learning, but it's also about supporting or reorganizing school and different contexts so that they support teachers' ongoing learning. That's part of the challenge, as well as just basics. And that implicates the practices of coaches, school leaders, and way up into the district central office. It involves the tools that people are using in practice. It involves the nature of the organizational routines in which they participate, and also constitute immediately contexts for their learning. So how did we go about this if we're trying to develop a theory of action? Well, we first of all selected and recruited these districts. They're typical of urban districts in many respects. Limited financial resources, high teacher turnover, and so forth. They were atypical in one respect. A quote I've used for years because I like it. This is from Richard Elmore, basically saying most schools and districts are clueless about how to respond productively to high-stakes accountability. Too true. Gaming the system, teaching directly to low-level tests, and so on and so forth. We worked to find and recruit districts back in 2006-07 in the teeth of No Child Left Behind that were aiming far higher. They had relatively ambitious agendas for students' mathematical learning. They specified what should be happening in classrooms. At least some folks in the districts had articulated relatively coherent visions of high-quality math instruction, and they had begun to begun to develop coherent sets of strategies. For example, they were already aware of the importance of supporting the learning of their principals as instructional leaders. So they were atypical in that respect. Suffice to say, we have to get onto planes to go to these places. There are not so many. As part of our preparation, in addition to recruiting the districts, we developed an initial set of conjectures by reviewing literature. I don't want to go into this except to say that it spans from issues of curriculum, associated resources like curriculum frameworks, all the way up through district leadership. So we're taking a pretty broad perspective here. And the idea was, in working with the districts, it would give us an opportunity to test, revise, and elaborate these conjectures that constituted our initial theory of action. So how did we go about that process of testing, revising, and elaborating? Well, we went to the district leaders and said, we want to be able to give you feedback on how your improvement initiatives are playing out in schools and classrooms. We therefore need to select a group of schools. So when we give you feedback, we're not just telling you a story about those 6 or 7 schools, that it's representative. So we selected a group of schools in each district that were representative in terms of the capacity for improvement. And I should have said we're focusing specifically on the middle grades. We then, within those schools, recruited randomly, or as randomly as we could, initially when there were 4 districts, 30 teachers, mathematics coaches who worked with them, school leaders who were responsible for mathematics, and district leaders across a number of departments. It basically worked out about 50 participants a district. When we went down to 2 districts, we doubled the number of participants. So a total of 200 participants each year. We then engage in this annual data collection cycle, an analysis cycle. We would go to each district in October and interview a number of district leaders, mainly in curriculum and instruction, including math and leadership, to document what are their improvement strategies for this year. We'd write this up in a short document, 4 pages or so, single-spaced, send it back, did we get it right? Usually we do minor changes. Then, between January and March, we do quite a large data collection. Amongst other things, what we're trying to do is document how their improvement strategies are playing out in schools and classrooms. So, a part of that, we would conduct audio-recorded interviews with each participant. So, when we were working with 4 districts, we spent a week in each district in January and did 200 interviews. And in addition, they will have online surveys. The issues we were trying to get at in the surveys and the interviews, the way I would put it to teachers, we really want to understand as best we can what it's like to be a teacher in this district. We're trying to understand what the context in which they work looks like from their point of view. So, for example, what are the formal and informal sources of support they draw on? What do they perceive themselves accountable for and to who? What tools are they using in practice, and so on and so forth, amongst other things. We collect a bunch of other data. I'm not going to go through the whole list. I do want to stress we videotape 2 consecutive lessons in each classroom, which we then code, mathematical knowledge for teaching assessment, and just going to go down there. For the first 4 years, we audio recorded teacher collaborative meetings, and then for the last 4 years, Lanny has been leading a group that has been investigating and analyzing teacher collaborative time. And so we've been videotaping selected teacher collaborative meetings in 3 or 4 schools in each of the 2 districts each year. And we refer to these as deep dive schools. And what we can do between February and May, we conduct an analysis just of the interviews and to some extent the surveys. What we're doing in those analyses is identifying and explaining differences between the district's theory of action, their expectations for how their policies were going to play out on the ground, and what our data indicates was actually happening. And in addition, we make actionable recommendations on how the districts might adjust or revise their policies for the following year to make them more effective. We write this up as a 15-page report to each district, and we organize it so we have their initial theory of action we sent to them, and it might have 3 planks in it. The first one might be something to do with supporting principals as instructional leaders. We say, here's what your strategy was. Here, how's that playing out? Here are our recommendations. So it's organized around what the districts are attempting to accomplish. Each year, we're always building on that. And then we go back and we have a 2-hour meeting with district leaders. And I believe it's fair to say these have kind of become big deal events for the district. We just did the last 2. There are well over 20 people there, leaders from across all of the major central office units. And they see it as using it to set direction for the planning work over the summer. The reason why we have to do it between February and May is beginning of the end of the school year, school districts plan over the summer for the following school year. And so notice that when we go back the following October, we have a way of documenting to what extent districts were picking up on and attempting to implement our recommendations. A colleague has done retrospective analysis of that. Is it all of our recommendations? Of course not, but it's actually a relatively high proportion. So this is, if you want to use the word intervention, a very weak intervention. And yet it appears to be consequential from the district's point of view. This is a research project, so where's the research in this? Why isn't this an unpaid consulting service? Why? Because one way to think about this is a set of parallel design experiments at the level of a district. But instead of daily or monthly cycles, a cycle takes a year. It's co-constituted by both the practitioners and the researchers, so it's a genuine partnership. Each of those squiggles is one yearly cycle. When you have to sit down and make actionable recommendations to a district that take account of their current capacity, are feasible, are grounded in whatever research is available, that concentrates the mind wonderfully. That's a context for us to have insights, and what we might figure out in District A has implications for what we might say to District B. Where are some of those insights coming from? The current theory of action informs it, but the insights we have in particular cases can lead to the revisions in the theory of action. So as in all design research, this is a real bootstrapping effort. I will only mention in passing that in addition, we are obviously doing a series of retrospective analyses and have a number of analyses team. Everything from focusing on aspects of teaching up through district leadership. Now, this next slide is the people involved. The one thing I want to say before I get to some of the characters, my motto when I started was start small and downsize. So I've really screwed up, and that's no joke, because this was not a dream. Erin Hendricks, our project manager and a remarkable character, I mentioned all of the data. Basically, we've had 100% success in collecting all data, including surveys, in every district every year. She's why. Lanny, of course, who you'll get to hear in a minute. Tom Smith and I started this. He's in policy and leadership. He just recently moved to the great state of California, where he's now dean at UC Riverside in education. Kara Jackson is quite, I would say, a beginning researcher, but she's no longer beginning. We've been at this so long. And Ken Frank, who investigates social networks, and he's been taking the lead in analyzing our network data. And then a huge list of past and present doctoral students and postdocs, many of whom, or a whole bunch of whom, are here somewhere. Now, the shameless commercial part begins. What does the current theory of action look like? Obviously, I haven't got time to throw it, but I'm going to use it instead to point for areas where the research base is thin to non-existent. If we talk about a coherent instructional system, first of all, explicit goals for students' learning and a vision of high-quality math instruction, what should be happening in classrooms? Yes. I think current math education research has a lot to say about that. Instructional materials, not perfect, but there are some materials. I'm thinking more of the materials that, what does that say? Thank you. I'm an old guy. User felt it. Supported by NSF, they're not perfect, but boy, they're a step in the right direction. And research has influenced them to some extent. Teacher professional development, I think, has really come on leaps and bounds in the last 10 years, and research on teacher learning has been quite dramatic. Under PD, we also include teacher collaborative time. I would say the research base is thinner there, particularly looking at teacher groups that are, quote, naturally occurring as opposed to researcher-led. And so we're very fortunate to be able to have Lanny keep us on the straight and narrow. Ongoing assessments, formative assessments, yeah, progress. But when we come, this would not have been on my radar when we started. Additional supports for struggling students. We've come to take the position in any instructional regime, there will be students who are currently struggling and need additional support. We have tried to look through the literature and identify designs or whatever can inform how to support students at scale in coming to be able to participate substantially in the context of mainstream instruction aiming at ambitious goals. And it's thin to non-existent. When I say that, people push back and say, but I did a case study on so-and-so. Fine, but where's the design work? At least even at a pilot stage, a district could trial and build on, or whatever. And so I think there's a huge gaping hole there. And then we move to the other components, mathematics coaches practices in providing job-embedded support. I've learned about that vicariously through working with a former graduate student, Lindsay Gibbons, and on content-focused coaching in general, and math in particular. The literature is astonishingly thin. I'm actually quite heartened that there was a couple of the posters I went around where people are looking at the development of teacher leaders or PD facilitators or whatever. This is critical. School leadership, it's really a whole bunch of different opinions. You might think you could go to the leadership literature. Adrian, who's sitting there, could tell you what the problems are with that. Part of the problem is that there's, by and large, what we would call an instructionally agnostic position. There's no particular commitment to a set of goals for student learning and thus a view of high-quality instruction. Such a vision is important because it influences policy all the way up into the district central office, and the same with district leadership. So from our point of view, there's a whole set of issues where district leaders are making decisions, and most of the decisions they're currently making about students perceived to be currently struggling are pretty grim right now. There are additional not good tutoring where they get pulled out, or poor devils get put in a second math class which is typically very procedurally oriented. Let's give them more of what doesn't work, in other words. So that we've got a whole set of issues here that we consider pressing. Now, in my last 7 minutes or so, I will try and address two issues badly. One is, briefly, we work in urban districts, so how are we attending to issues of equity? Two ways, if I've got time. Our working definition is consistent, I believe, with what Alan was talking about this morning. Math instruction is equitable if, or to the extent, that students can participate substantially in rigorous activity, meaning they are supported to be able to, and they learn some mathematics worthwhile and are developing productive mathematical identities in the process. We focus particularly on English language learners and currently struggling African American students because that's a concern for the districts. This is a partnership. One thing we've been trying to do is identify, quote, equity in practice. In other words, particular instructional practices that appear to support all students learning, including particularly those two groups of students. How do we go about that? Kara Jackson led this work. We've coded a lot of videos over the years, 1,700. We can put screens on. That's a great resource now. So we can first of all say, which of all of these videos did the teacher maintain the level of cognitive challenge throughout the video, which got high codes from our point of view. Then we can add to that which of those teachers on state achievement tests, students perform well and they closed achievement gaps. Not many, but there are some, thank heavens. And then go in and do in-depth qualitative analysis of those lesson videos. And we've been identified one practice, for example, which concerns how tasks, rigorous tasks, are introduced or launched. We're going to be doing more work along those lines coming up. We think that's important when we get down to the level of specific concrete practices that can constitute goals for teachers' learning. Why? Because when we map out from those practices, we have to think about how can we support teachers' development of those practices. That then leads us to think about coaches. So in other words, it's equity all the way up. It's not a separate thing. It's part of what a vision of constitutes high-quality math instruction. Second thing we've done is, at this level of scale, we have to develop measures. And we realize how handicapped we are by the dearth of good measures of stuff that's actually worth measuring. One that Kara led the development of rejoices in the name of VSMC, Views of Students' Mathematical Capabilities. It's an interview-based measure. In our interviews, we ask teachers, any kids in your classroom struggling? Well, yeah. And we ask, who are they? And then we ask, what are your reasons, or why do you think they're struggling? And we code on a continuum, and you can guess what it is, I think. At one end of the continuum, they would say, point to the kids, something inherent in the kids, their families, and their communities. We would code that as unproductive. At the other end, they would talk about something to do with the quality of the instruction the kids have received, possibly their instructional histories, or whatever. Something that they or others in the school can do something about. We would code that as productive. The second aspect of it is prognostic, and asking teachers how they are responding or to support these students. Unproductive would, 3 minutes, unproductive would be to lower the level of rigor, to leave out the tough parts of the task, to proceduralize tasks. Productive would be figuring out how to give those kids additional forms of support so that they can engage in rigorous mathematical activities. We would consider that equitable and making possible for kids to participate in mathematical activities as rigorous as those of other students. I will skip this part, other than saying we're investigating the relationship between a whole bunch of measures, and my suspicion is that this measure, VSMC, is going to prove to be pretty important in terms of relationships between what teachers are actually doing, codes of the classroom, and whatever. The last example in 1 minute, 2 minutes, I'm not going to go through it, obviously, I have no time. It was about, because the project I've told you is big, right? It's very big. What could you do, and I wanted to give an example of a much smaller side thing Kara and I led, where we just worked with one district to explore conjectures about supporting the learning of coaches, principals, and district math leaders. And so that's what it was about. One district just hired 3 new district-based math coaches who were pretty handy based on our data on their work as teachers. So I'm going to skip through all of this and just show you the design. So there's only 3 people we're trying to support the learning of. We had 3 cycles like this. We started out and we worked with the district leaders to co-lead and co-design and co-lead the PD. Why would we do that? It would be much easier for us to do it on our own. Because we wanted to support the development of district leaders in supporting coaches and principals learning. For us, the goal is not to figure out how to provide services. The goal is to figure out how to support the development of district capacity. How can we build the district's capacity to support coaches learning, to support teachers learning? Secondly, we went to the district and we co-led the professional development for their middle school principals and also the guys that supervised them, the secondary math directors. Then we did a parallel session for teachers. Why did we work with both groups? Because one of our primary conjectures is the importance of alignment between what principals are looking for the expectations they're communicating to teachers and what coaches are working on with teachers. The coaches would then pilot, we would design an upcoming teacher PD with them that focused on a lesson that the math leaders had identified as problematic. They would go off and do that PD, which was videotaped. We would then analyze the PD, feed the result back to the math leaders, and co-design the next session. So all we did was 3 cycles of that with a planned handover to the math leaders who led a 4th cycle. So I hope that that sort of thing, we can argue, and we believe that's an instance of attempting to investigate supporting instructional improvement at scale, yet it's, I would hope, a much smaller scale, tractable sort of problem. And maybe you take off some of the add-ons, like maybe you just focus on coaches rather than school leaders. But we see, so end of my advocacy, a burning need to address a bunch of these sorts of questions and issues. I'm out of time. So over to Lanny.